Okay, we're back for episode number 4 of In the Middle Men. John, Lewis, and Trevor. First of all, a big thank you to our recent YouTube viewers, all 60 of them. I think we've even got six or seven subscribers now. So we're going to work on the optics as well, and maybe improve things on the YouTube side of things. And I wanted to start this week, and just to give the date, it is 6th of June 2020. And I think I'm going to give a big round of applause this week, because I think this week has been an amazing week for China. I think the CCP particularly are very happy this week due to events that are not in their control or actually abroad. So just to bring people up to speed, we've got the protests in America, which have seemingly turned more peaceful from rioting, which may be a good thing. But nevertheless, that's worldwide news at the minute. It's also been a good week for China because they've managed to keep the Tiananmen Square anniversary off the front pages, because the world has been distracted by these worldwide protests. Other things as well for China, Huawei have come out with some quite strong rhetoric, how they're going to overtake Google and become the world's leading company. We've used some quite strong words there. And apparently Wuhan has tested all 10 million residents for the coronavirus in the space of, I think, 18 days, which again makes the rest of the world look extremely inefficient. Also, the British government has now declared, and also the World Health Organization has now declared, that masks should be worn, face masks, 15 weeks into the coronavirus pandemic. Again, this makes China look very good, as masks have been obligatory there since the very start of the pandemic. And, things are looking very good for China. Trump could be in some trouble. He was pretty much nailed on to become president against Joe Biden, or Sleepy Joe as people call him. But, due to the unrest and the uncertainty, Biden's probably got a strong chance now. People might be voting for a period of peace and calm rather than to forward these hard lines. So, like I say, in terms of the Chinese propaganda machine that we talked about last week, they haven't had to do much this week. The world has done it for them, and they're kind of very happy at the moment with that. Well, that's the way I feel about it. Trevor, how do you think this has been a good week for China?
Just yes and no. I mean, it's China. It's a land of 1,000 contradictions. As many good things as you've noted here, there are diplomatic issues. Like now, there's just such blatant irony in some head of foreign ministry officials tweeting. Well, first of all, they're tweeting on a platform that is not available in China for Facebook to not essentially censor and choose what political narrative they want, it's just so much hypocrisy that, I mean, anyone who's aware of the situation is just kind of laughing at it.
Yeah.
And it goes on. There's other things that hear this, and it leads perfectly into our discussion today, which is about faith and how even the wrong words at the wrong time can be very humiliating anywhere. And these words saying that Facebook shouldn't censor international politically oriented content is ridiculous and hilarious.
Yeah. So just to recap where we are, last week we talked about propaganda, the Chinese propaganda machine, and how successful it can be and how efficient it can be. And I think you've mentioned the word narrative there. What I've kind of realized this week is that in the West, the word narrative, it's kind of like our new word for propaganda, the idea to control the narrative, or the zeitgeist of popular public opinion. Everyone's fighting for this narrative, and You know, people will suck it up as much as they can. If you can control the narrative, you know, you can control this with other people. And you know, this is a bit different from China, but I think it's kind of our new version of what we call propaganda. You know, irrespective of how well versed you are about things, whether you've actually read books, whether you really know about issues that you're virtue signaling about, you know, if you can get people to jump on bandwagons and follow the narrative, this is like the new arm of propaganda in the West. And also, I just think, just one last thing about last week is that I think we were a bit unjust that we didn't talk about the Western side of things, particularly the American, with the anti-Chinese propaganda. So I think at some point we have to revisit to talk about the Epoch Times, or the Epoch Times, depending how you pronounce it, and maybe the likes of Steve Bannon as well. I think they're the two big thorns in the CCP side at the minute. Steve Bannon can be very interesting. Do you know Steve Bannon, guys?
I'm not familiar with him.
Trevor?
Yeah, he gained a lot of publicity, notoriety with his involvement in the campaign of 2016.
Yeah, and he's pretty much hanging all his hanging his coat on the China thing now. He's got a very antagonistic tone about China. Some of the stuff he says is pretty good. You know, historically he's right, but he's going guns blazing for the CCP at the moment. He's a bit miffed because he's not getting as much. The narrative isn't following what he wants due to other events. But yeah, I think we have to look at kind of stuff he's saying, and then how the Epoch Times is run as well, because a lot of these high-end glossy anti-China videos, they are financed and produced via Epoch Times, and they have considerable money put in them, and some of the Chinese diaspora placed in other countries, they do support the Epoch Times. So anyway, I think we go back to that in the future. So Lewis, life in China, okay. Our idea today is to try and introduce the concept of face, and trying to explain it and offer the audience some examples of experiencing this thing, the face. And it's not just specific to China, but obviously our experiences with it. So, can you offer us any understanding or anecdotes to start with?
Yeah, I mean, before I went to China, I think it's sort of a phrase that most people have heard of even before they go to China, this idea of face and face being important. And from what I understood, I just thought, well, isn't it just being embarrassed, right? Losing face is being embarrassed.
Yeah.
And I think that's largely what it is. I don't think it's necessarily unique to China. I think maybe what is different to in Western countries is the things that make Chinese people lose face that they feel embarrassed by. And I think that can be quite a cultural difference in a lot of ways, but also the way that they respond, both or sometimes don't respond when they're embarrassed, when they feel they've lost face. I think a lot of the body language and the way that they respond can be misinterpreted, misread by somebody from a Western perspective. So from my experience, I think I had first couple of years in China, I had a couple of points where there were, I think there was sort of like a bit of a misunderstanding. Maybe I misread the situation because I was reading it from a sort of British perspective, and actually from a Chinese perspective, the other people didn't understand why I was behaving the way I was. So just trying to think off the top of my head certain anecdotes. I find with, from my experience of face and Chinese people losing face, a lot of it is you can't make it really clear to somebody when they've made a mistake. If you almost force them into a corner where they have to admit they made a mistake, they often will not be very happy about that. Whereas as a British person, there's nothing I love more than apologizing for things. Sorry, sorry, sorry. every other word that comes out of my mouth as a British person is sorry. I apologize for not bumping into somebody, but just being a bit too close to them when I walk past. And that was before social distancing. And I think as a British person in China, actually China, when somebody points out that you made a mistake, that you've done something wrong, they don't say sorry, but they just walk away and pretend the situation never happened. And I think they expect me to do the same thing. And that happened quite a few times. So yeah, I think one anecdote, just to give one anecdote that comes to mind when I was thinking about this was, and this is what really made me sit and think about the difference of what happened in the situation, because I had a little bike. It was a tiny little fold-up bike with tiny little wheels that I was riding when I was going to university in Hangzhou. And I ride to university, ride back, and every day I'd ride up and down this pedestrianized street in the kind of like touristy area. And I mean, I'm riding this tiny little bike with these tiny little wheels, not very fast. And there were people going up and down on electric scooters, like the e-bikes, quite fast up and down the street sometimes. And I'm just cycling this little bike, so I just think it's okay. And one day when I was coming back from university, and I wasn't actually cycling down the street. I think I was just pushing the bike down the street. And there's like a security guy on the street, what they call Bao'an, just like these ubiquitous security guards that are everywhere. And he just like came over, tapped the bike with a stick, and then turned away and walked off. And I was just like, what on earth is that about? And I didn't know why is he just hitting my bike? So I just carry on pushing the bike, and he comes over and he hits the bike again, and then turns away and walks off. I'm like, why is he not saying anything to me? Why is he not talking to me? So eventually, like when he did it like the third time, I was just like, what's up? What's wrong? And he was saying, oh, you can't, ride your bike down here. And I was a bit miffed. I was like, well, why didn't you just say that? Why didn't you just say you can't ride your bike down here? Why is he hitting the bike and walking away? And then I was saying to him, well, don't be ridiculous. I'm not riding the bike. I'm just pushing it. And there's people riding electric scooters at like 30 miles an hour going up and down the street right behind you. And I mean, I don't know, like if I'd caused him to lose face by saying he's not doing his job well, but he was just reacted kind of not very happy, shall we say. And it was sort of like he was getting a bit aggressive towards me. And an old Chinese guy just came up to me and said, oh, just walk off, leave the street, and then go onto the street on that side street there, and you can ride your bike down it. And I was like, is he not going to see that? But then I look and I see all these people on these electric e-bikes and bicycles are going up and down the street. They're doing it behind his back as though he's pretending that he can't see it. And I don't know, I just kind of felt like there was a lot of, for me, that like he was, maybe when he was hitting the bike, he was sort of trying to stop me from losing face. If he comes over and directly says to me, you can't ride your bike down here, you have to leave, then that's putting a confrontational situation there where I have to lose face by backing down. Whereas if he just taps the bike and walks away, then he can pretend that he didn't tap the bike. I can pretend that nothing happened. We don't have to acknowledge each other and we can walk off. And I feel like when in China, like a lot of time when Chinese people lose face, it's because they've been pushed into a situation where they have to acknowledge they did something wrong. So maybe his behavior, which I didn't understand as a British person, was actually him trying to save me face by not making me acknowledge that I'd done something wrong. But then when I was saying to him, hey, there's people riding their bikes up and down the street, I was forcing him into a situation where he had to acknowledge that he was doing something wrong. And then he was kind of losing face, and that's why he was acting aggressively to me. I don't know if that sounds right to you guys.
Yeah, it's different. I mean, look, it's kind of a difficult thing to explain. I'm going to get Trevor's take on it. But Lewis, seeing as you're well, both of you are the linguists in this conversation, and also just anyone watching interested, they should check out Lewis's blog. It's one of the most successful blogs, I think, about learning Chinese. It's called mandarincorner.org. Is that right?
mandarincornerblog.com.
mandarincornerblog.com. Okay. So could you, Lewis, what's the Chinese word for face, for the concept we're talking about?
So do you mean like face or losing face? Because if they say lose face, then they say 丢脸.
Right. Okay. Yeah. But just for face in itself, it's mianzi, right?
Yeah, mianzi is face.
Yeah.
But they use a different word when they say lose face usually.
Right. Okay. So you
can like give somebody face, like给mianzi.
Okay. Okay. So I mean, Trevor, you spent a lot of time uh, deep in the within the Chinese community.
The rabbit hole.
Yeah, down. You went really far down the rabbit hole, actually, and you kind of abandoned the expat community, I think, for most of your time in China, didn't you? Where's Trevor? Oh, he's gone. He's he's with his new friends now. So, I mean, you must have been exposed to quite a lot of this and seen how it works within the business environment and the social environment, and you must have learned to navigate the signals quite well. Is that true?
I can't say that I'm an expert, because I think even a lot of Chinese people will tell you, if you're talking about how deep the rabbit hole, Mianzi just is a never-ending complex Chinese knot that is entirely contextual, and it's not a static principle-based thing where you should always do the same thing in all situations, following a principle, and gain face. The same thing in two different situations may gain face and or lose face. So it's quite complex, and it's a topic I love talking about. And Lewis, you mentioned something about a bicycle, and I have a great story that kind of illustrates this bicycle. I've been in Hangzhou, a southern city, for about like 5 years already, and like you said, I was quite deep involved in as the only expat that had worked there and spoke Chinese, and it was very Hangzhou oriented, with a large group of people that had graduated from Hangzhou University, which is now part of Zhejiang University. Is very prestigious, but it goes without saying, all the people spoke a lot of Hangzhou dialect, which I can't really speak, but I understand a lot. And especially being involved in the sports world, I know cussing. So I know specifically when someone is cussing me out and swearing at me in Hangzhounese. And the story about a bicycle, which I inherited, a friend gave it to me. They said they found it on the bike rack, and it was growing grass, and weeds were literally growing through the chains. So, and I needed a bike at the time, and I had already lost 3 bikes that were stolen, and I just wanted an old raggedy bike. So this was perfect. And I brought it to the local bike fixer guy who's in like a back alley, who barely speaks Putonghua Mandarin. And I bring it to him, and it's got dirt, it's mess, the brakes aren't working. I mean, it's a POS bike, but that's what I wanted. And I needed it to be fixed up so at least it would be somewhat usable. And I bring it to him, and this guy he just sees it, and I'm saying, I want to fix it, and he starts going off. He just full on Hangzhou, 这个买辫子什么料儿? Like, he calls me a son of a bitch, a stupid idiot, and I directly called him out on it. And I said, 谁是买辫子? Like, who's the son of a bitch and who's the stupid idiot? And he looks at me, pale-faced, he had no intention of actually me understanding that and me losing face by him cussing at me. And then from his pale, horrified face, he goes like, what country are you from? I said, I'm from the US. And he goes, wow, America's such a great country. Full of wonderful people. I love the movies from America, the Hollywood movies and all this stuff. And he just goes this 180 from like unintentionally making me lose face to intentionally trying to make me gain face in his presence. And it was all through this bike. And I love this story. I love telling it to a lot of Chinese friends who find it very funny too. But that was an example of face. But my first experience with face was, because like Lewis was saying, a lot of people before going to China, they hear about this concept of face, but they have no idea how it works. And until you get in a specific situation like that, where you see the complexity and the dichotomy of it, it's hard to really understand and operate with the knowledge of it. And to give you an example, a friend of mine, an American friend of mine, whose name is Bob, and he's very, let's say, he's very charming, articulate, but he's also very provocative and somewhat antagonistic. He and I were traveling in China, and I'd already been in China for a year, and he wanted a Chinese name. He was sick of being called Lobote. So I gave him a Chinese name, which I thought was suitable, which was 不要脸, which, Louis, you can translate that. It means
Sorry.
不要脸.
要脸.
不要脸.
Oh, 不要脸. Oh, like, yeah, I don't want face, right?
It's like, yeah, you don't want face means like you have no shame. So when you're yelling, 你不要脸,你真不要脸.
Yeah,
right.
You have no shame. You have no integrity, no honor. So I give him this name, and he goes around introducing himself as 不要脸. And seeing people's reaction is like, this is literally the most shameful name you could give yourself. It's like naming yourself in the Western world like Satan or Adolf.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
It's the reaction of just how that was. But another thing that we would do jokingly, we were in Hunan province, which is the birthplace of Chairman Mao.
Mm.
We'd be in these taxis, and it's very common for not just taxis, but all cars would have the head, a pendant of Chairman Mao, right hanging from their rearview mirror.
Yeah.
And it's kind of superstitious, like it's supposed to bring you luck or whatnot. But anyways, we would get in these taxis, 不要脸 and me, and we would ask the taxi driver, who's that guy on your hanging there? And they said that's Chairman Mao, that's Mao Zedong.
Yeah.
I would say in Chinese, well, who's that? We would ask these taxi drivers and see the reactions, and some of them thought it was just hilarious.
Yeah.
These ignorant barbarians have been living in a cave their whole life. They don't know the most important person in world history. Versus the opposite end of the spectrum, where some of these taxi drivers were quite angry.
Yeah.
And insulted that we would cause them to lose face by not having the knowledge of something that is so significant to them that is now a superstitious pendant and token of prosperity in their life. Just a very strong symbol. So yeah, those are my kind of stories of.
But look, I think with those stories. I think that I think it's very close to saying that that's kind of a form of diplomacy, right? Saying, that you don't want someone to have very hurt feelings. You try and salvage a situation to continue a dialogue, as within your bike story, and the guy not realizing you understand Chinese. And then, with the taxi drivers playing ignorant to knowing who Chairman Mao was, you could easily get that with a taxi driver and a tourist in London, looking at a picture of maybe Winston Churchill or someone like that, where some people just find it very funny or just lambast you for being ignorant and quite angry about it and have a negative view of foreigners. I think face can get very serious though. And like I said before, my first experience with face was actually in Thailand, because in all of these Eastern cultures, you will often hear within their own words about face and how to salvage it, how to not push someone in a corner. And one of my roles is onboarding a number of teachers. I've had to write a lot of marketing material for my company over the past couple of years, is explaining Chinese culture and cultural differences, anything from differences in toilets to food and so forth. But then I try and explain face, and I think my best definition for it, I think Louis, you kind of agree with me, is it becomes very noticeable when that someone is wrong, they make a mistake, a person in a position of authority, but you can never tell them that they've made a mistake. And they must not think that that they've made a mistake, even though everyone knows that they made a mistake. And you kind of must just carry on as not to make them feel a form of embarrassment or lose the good perception of those around them, like a kind of social status or even a status in that time and moment, you know. So you kind of have to be very, very careful how you judge situations. And what's interesting is when you get into the high-end think tanks on China, the strategy, you know, these guys that are looking at long-term strategies of having to deal with China in America and Europe, some of them are actually very good. And I can't remember the name of the author of one who wrote a paper on one of the. I should have prepared really for this, but he said that he thinks in the next 20 or 30 years, the single most important thing in learning to how to deal with China is understanding face and that their reputation can remain intact and bring them into the Western dialogue or the Western world. It's kind of like treat them with kid gloves and gently coax them. Don't go head on and challenge them on very sensitive issues that they deem sovereign issues, because they will just have this recoiling action where they will feel like they're losing face. Now, obviously, this is a national perception because face works nationally and individually. And when I read that, I actually thought this guy was bang on the money. I do think that in terms of Western diplomacy with China, operating these fine lines of face and saving face is going to be very important, because in the West, I think we have particularly dealt with the idea of facing the music or swallowing our pride. It's been ingrained in us over a number of years now. I mean, look at what's happening now with the concept of white guilt and prostrating or taking the knee, you know, that we are prepared collectively and individually to lose face to resolve an argument. Okay. Now, I cannot say that that's the case within the East, and certainly not in China, is that they have not yet got to this position where they are willing to lose substantial face or have substantial admittance of wrongness in order to progress. And this can be historically or within the business world and so forth. And I would just give one example, and this is quite a big example, and this happened most recently, just before I left China. So I was invited to a meeting with my CEO at the time, and I wanted this meeting anyway because there was a number of things I wasn't so happy with. I just point out my CEO is a woman, and I've been urging her to change the business model about recruiting teachers for a number of months. I said, my feelings, I won't go into details, but I said it's not sustainable and there's certain things that were questionable. So we went in for a bit of a chat, a serious chat. And when I walked in there, the head, should I say this? Well, I can say, the head of Hangzhou police was there, which is quite no big thing. They have a lot of connections. So this guy's pretty high up. And it's quite interesting because he was just dressed in civvies. He wasn't dressed in uniform or anything, but I was told just before I walked in that he was in there, obviously smoking, as Chinese men do in meetings. He couldn't understand English. He couldn't understand a bit, and obviously my Chinese wasn't good enough to understand every word he was saying in as fast as he was saying it. But anyway, we had a big bash out of a conversation, and I was quite, shall we say, this was me talking to my boss as well as some other managers in there. And I was quite forceful with my opinions. And I was saying how we need to change the business model. And he listened quietly. And after 30 minutes, kind of everyone was in the room. Everyone else could speak English relatively well. And we kind of all were in agreement that, yeah, things have got to change. And we should move forward. At this point, I kind of made my excuses because I had an appointment elsewhere. And I noticed that the chief of police was quite angry. Well, not angry, but he was very stern in his look, didn't maintain any eye contact with me. So I left the room thinking that, great, we're going to get a new strategy to move forward. Everything's going to be good. get a new working relationship. Anyway, 2 days later, I speak to one of the managers I've got a good relationship with and saying, right, we're going to work on this new way forward. And she's like, yeah, the boss has had kind of a change of mind, a bit unsure, whether it's a good idea. And I'm like, really? Well, I thought we were all in agreement. We had that big talk. Anyway, it transpires that when I left the room, the chief of police was not happy that a foreigner is coming into a Chinese business telling people how to operate. And he went on a big diatribe saying how proud he was as this company and that they're doing things right and they 100% shouldn't change, especially if someone who's not Chinese is coming in to tell them how to do business. I mean, it's part of my job. That's what they hired me for, like as a consultant, right? And I was pretty surprised about this and a bit angry because from what I could see, it was simply his only reasoning was that he felt that I was swaggering my status more than it should be. I walked into a room full of Chinese people and I was a bit too forceful with my opinions and strategy, and he pushed back against it. And from that day, what we agreed was pretty much overturned. Nothing went forward from what we get, and they still carried on with the same old strategy. And it's really down to me threatening, shall we say, this face. Have you had? I know that took that was long-winded, but I thought that was
an interesting story, though, John. You hadn't told me about that one before.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's a bit sensitive, to be honest, and I'm hoping certain people don't watch it.
I think one of the key points there was it was the fact that you weren't seen as the senior person in the room.
Yeah, that's right.
Therefore, they shouldn't be listening to you on the decisions. And I think like a lot of that comes in with. I've got like a similar experience when I was working as it was like joint programs manager for basically setting up joint programs for university and universities in English-speaking countries. And I was told by the sort of the dean of head of the department for one of the for the university I was working for in China that they wanted to focus on, or they thought it was best to focus on English speaking for the students who were due to go on what they call like 3+2 programs. They do 3 years undergraduate in China, and then it's like a joint program with the university in an English speaking country where they do 2 years and get a master's degree from both universities. And after speaking with the English department at the university they were going to, I was told that there's no way they should be working on speaking. That's really easy to improve. What they need to work on is specifically like English for academic purposes writing. And I basically like the dean of this department, who didn't really know about English teaching. She couldn't really speak English herself at all, really. She was just, I don't know where she got these ideas from of this sort of syllabus design that she drew up where they were going to focus on speaking, but it seemed like she would just pulled it out of thin air without really consulting anybody. But nobody wanted to say no to her because she was the head of that department and she made the decisions. And when I said to the other colleagues in the department, well, we've been told by the partner universities that these students need to work on their English writing, I was basically told, don't say that to the dean, don't say that to the head. Just tell the teachers to do that in the class. But as long as you don't have to actually directly conflict with the person and say you were wrong, we don't need to be working on this, then it'll be okay. But if I bring that up as an issue and say, actually, no, we don't need to do that, then it's going to be a problem. And I thought that was a lot of like coming down to face it, where it's like, she's in the position above and she's made a mistake. She said something about the syllabus that actually isn't what the universities in this case it was University in New Zealand, were saying they wanted, but that I can't pass that on to her because she's above me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's linked in with the lines of authority are very close to how the hierarchy, how face works, you know. And I also think it's important that it's so important that we understand face, and alongside that the word, the English word, which is to kowtow to something, and that comes from a Chinese word. Trevor, what's the Chinese word?
Kowtow. Bow your head.
Yeah, so it just means bow your head, basically. And the word kowtow in English comes from it directly, because it used to be something that the emperor would insist on. It was, you know, a sign of stability in society, submission. That's with many cultures, you know, whether it's Islam, which means submission, and so forth. So it's I mean, again, this is very relevant to what's going on today, to kowtow to things, whether it's ideology or authority, and it's ingrained in China alongside face, is that that individuals in powerful positions, and China as a nation needs to feel that it has some kind of ascension, that other entities are bowing to it, or at least showing a willingness to kowtow, because it's historically so important throughout their existence. And again, when the West come along with kind of hard rhetoric, you know, talking about Chinese human rights, you know, talking about Hong Kong, Taiwan, all these hot issues, when they're bulldozing their way in, trying to, you know, confront China on it, it's just going to send them back to a corner, and it's going to invoke this kind of face response. You know, you're threatening the perception of ourselves, and this is also embedded in history. You know, it's why certain amount of history is, shall we say, is hidden, or at least the interpretation of history has its own. I'll give you one example today, and then I'll ask Lewis to carry on. So actually, I've been doing some lessons online this week, and one of them, I set some homework about the bubonic plague of 1347, and some of the kids have VPNs. They're at international schools, so they can get on Google. But a couple of the kids actually had to use Baidu. And I presume that they actually searched in Chinese and then just translated.
Of course.
Yeah, as they do. And interestingly, I asked for the historical origins, and I'm sure, as most people know, it was originally the plague arose in China. Okay, the bubonic plague, and so all the kids that had the VPNs, they were like, yeah, and they followed the story all the way through. And then the two kids that had used Baidu, they said, yeah, it originated in North Mongolia. And I'm like, what? And straight away I said, did you guys use Baidu? You know, what's going on here? And they were like, yeah. And, you know, I had to dress them up occasionally, but it goes to show even sensitive information like this, and this is why it's very important with what's going on with COVID, is that they're willing to overlook certain parts of historical truth if it perhaps makes them look weak or embarrassed, shall we say. Now, you know, the plague was 700 years ago, and there are good sound reasons that are beyond China's fault why diseases happen in China. But it seemed to me deliberately that these two kids working independently, the first sources they could find on Chinese internet was blaming Mongolia for the plague which had started in China in 1346.
Like Americans blame Canada, Chinese blame the Mongols.
Well, that's it. But it's not that, it's an absolute ignorance of truth. Like it's like they're trying to preserve a degree of integrity, of perception. And that, I think that's understandable with any culture. But I do think in the West, we have been forced, and again, that's linked back, I think one of the big turning points was the abolition of slavery and the growth of Protestantism, particularly, alongside Catholicism, with the idea of sin and guilt, where we've been forced really to face up rather than save face. Lewis, do you know what I mean by that?
You're talking about in terms of the. So I was just thinking about what you said about the history thing, because that really fascinated me, but did not surprise me at all.
Yeah.
But it is really it's kind of it is quite a tricky topic historically when you think about it, because at that time.
Yeah, I know what you're going to say.
The Yuan dynasty was actually China had been conquered by the Mongols, or if you want to look at it from a Chinese perspective, the Mongolian ethnicity of China had taken over the rule, the mandate of heaven in China, and China had not been conquered by Mongolia, because Mongolia has historically always been part of China, depending on which way you want to look at it. But it is a tricky argument, because it's the Mongols were ruling China, or China was ruled by the ethnically Mongol Chinese people from that part of China called Mongolia.
But I mean, that's interesting, because they are revered. I mean, Kublai Khan and Genghis Khan is the two great Khans of the Mongol Empire. They are revered in China today, because largely it's a part of their history. Even though they were conquered, the Mongolians were ethnically different. They're accepted that they are kind of part of China. And, when I spent time, I went to Mongolia, and there's a huge statue of Genghis Khan there, and it's been paid for by the Chinese. And the only other tourists there were Chinese tourists marveling at Genghis Khan. But the reality is that 700 years ago, he was raping and slaughtering ethnic Han Chinese, But it's kind of been, because
it's proud here.
Well, because it's been so, it's something that really they can't retain the face about, right? They have to kind of try a new tact of just absorbing it into their culture. It's not like the great loss of face, which is do they call it, in Chinese, what do they call the 100 years of embarrassment? What's it called, Trevor?
Oh, for the Chinese for it? I don't know, because it's not often talked about.
Yeah.
It's a sore subject, like the Cultural Revolution.
Well, you say it's not talked about, but I think it's definitely relevant, right? It's like, again, they do sense this national sense of embarrassment.
Definitely. I think it's probably the main source of Chinese. How can you put it, like victim identity? Which they and it's definitely a sticking point in terms of their kind of defensiveness, particularly when Westerners are making criticisms about China, or when they're sort of comparing themselves, like you said at the start of this discussion about China wanting to compare with or take over, Google. The idea of like inferiority to the West sort of stems from this 100 years of 100 years of humiliation, or whatever they call it?
100 years of humiliation, yeah, that's what they call it. And their policies, believe me, I really think a lot of their policies are organized around this, of having to, shall we say, bring back the face or remedy these 100 years of humiliation, which was basically European powers controlling China, or having extreme influence over the majority of China. Not so much central China, but you had the British, the Germans, and the French, and the Chinese were kowtowing to Western powers, and it's been, shall we say, niggling away at them for a long time. And one more interesting thing is, I once had quite a deep conversation, and I always suspected this, but with you actually know him, but I won't say his name in case he doesn't want to put out. About fentanyl. So, as you know, the fentanyl epidemic in America, a lot of that pretty much all of it is being produced in Chinese factories. And pretty much the end of the conversation was like, well, it's market driven, and plus the British did it to us, so we're justified in doing it to the Americans.
Against what it's us. Thanks.
Well, yeah, so you take all the heat. Well, we had the foresight to ban it quite early on, fentanyl. So, there's this, believe me, there are discussions around in rooms that bring up, and they're looking at, an eye for an eye. They're looking at ways
for another eye.
Retribution. And you know,
but it's also interesting that it's not the distinction between America and Britain. It's right, you know, Britain did this, so we're justified in treating another country in this way.
Well, yeah, and I think when it suits them, they will put UK and Europe and America together. Like when it does suit them, you know, Britain may have been the biggest, the better retribution, but actually, hey, if you're going to make 25% of Americans dependent on fentanyl and cause massive crime and destabilize society, that's like, well, you did it to us, you know, we had it done to you. Let's see how you like it. And you know, obviously that can never be said out loud, but it's that kind of feeling that does drive things, and it does drive policy. And again, it's this feeling of justice in retribution in the guise of justice, in disguise of justice, because of this loss of face, because of the 100 years of humiliation. And I think they feel in general, not just the CCP, but shall we say the zeitgeist of Chinese culture feels that it's time to get it back. You know, it's time for the West to suffer in some ways and put China back on its rightful place as having to be kowtowed to. Now, maybe I'm wrong about it. Maybe I've overanalyzed that geopolitically, but you know, having had so many conversations with people, and it always ends with this justification of, well, it happened to us, so why shouldn't it happen to you? What do you think, Trevor? You think
history in China is a sensitive topic. I mean, you needed. Last week you talked a lot about these anti-Japanese World War II occupation of China and the movies that are prolific. They always have been, but they're more so than ever, and in both the making of them recently and the broadcasting of them. And it's actually illegal in China to write things that are contrary to historical past, or even write anything about the future. That's why most Chinese films are seldom about the near future. Like, what was it? What was the name of that movie? From Frank Wu, the one about the Lonely Planet, right?
Right.
That was about the future, but it's sort of
the Wandering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
like the Wandering Planet. Yeah.
That's one of the few Chinese films about China and Chinese characters that is portrayed in the future, but it's a very distant future. So I think it's tough to talk about that. I will say, just as I won't let the U.S. just get the bus thrown on it in this waterfall of opium war to fentanyl destruction, and it is very hypocritical when you look at American contributions to early Chinese industrialization in the early 20th century, as well as the foundation of modern education in China, and Americans' contributions to the first and one of the most prestigious educational institutions, which is Beijing University. But we won't even get into that. I did want to, when we were talking about face, I did want to talk about one of the, it's kind of underground, but it's big into a scene of which I know, which is soccer, or is it across the pond you call football. Did you hear anything about KOWTOWING?
Yes. I did want to talk about this. Yeah, this is juicy. Okay, tell us what's going on. I know this story. It's good.
So, KOWTOWING, he was the former leading scorer of the Chinese national team.
Hmm.
Now think about that's important. How can you be the former? That means someone else scored more goals than him recently. Well, that didn't happen. In fact, unofficially now, if you look on Baidu and you check the national team's website, it starts with number 2, which is Yang Xu, and who's that other guy? Su Maozhen. Yeah, Su Maozhen, who have 27 goals. KOWTOWING scored 50 goals, almost twice as much as either of them in his career. And a lot of these goals were directly contributing to China's first and only ever qualification for the FIFA World Cup in 2002. And the furthest they've ever progressed in the Asian Cup. He has far and away the most number of goals in Chinese professional league history. He's the equivalent of Michael Jordan, or who's a very dominant British footballer in terms of his record in scoring.
Yeah.
Who's English? Alan Shearer. He's an Alan Shearer.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And just world-class level for the environment of which he came from. This last week, he, as a person who's been involved in the sports bureau, an official party member, and he's been outspoken about anti kind of state involvement in sport and the complexity of that, and why it's inhibiting Chinese soccer. But this last week, he came out with a outrageous public video about how there should be a regime change in China, the kind of thing that is just a fantasy of someone of his publicity, of his being so publicly visible and known throughout China, calling for a regime change because of the social problems that have come from the CCP rulership, and how all problems essentially stem for it. And for there to be any positive future in China, there needs to be a new government system, starting with the end of the current one. So, like I said, he's been scrubbed from the internet. You can't find his name anywhere. You can't comment on his Weibo posts. You can't find any information about his career. He's gone. And imagine Alan Shearer just coming out and speaking and saying British Parliament is a fallacy and it's a huge problem, and then all of his records just disappearing.
Yeah, that's right. Just to put this in perspective, you're right to use someone like Angie. He was a big deal in China at the time. He retired I think over 10 years ago, right? Yeah. But he was a household name. Now, he wasn't living in China, and his wife is actually successful as well. She was an Olympic badminton player. I think she was a bronze medalist in 2006 Olympics. So they were quite a kind of a posh and Beck's couple, shall we say. Like they had a bit of status, not super status, certainly not within any political wrangling. But it's the equivalent of, they have both disappeared from the Chinese internet. So it's like Trevor said, it's like, imagine one day Alan Shearer disappears from all the archives, from Wikipedia, from Facebook, from his Instagram account gets deleted. They've both just disappeared. They kind of don't exist anymore.
Internationally, yes, they do. They're fine and well. Let's clarify that.
Yeah, just on Chinese.
Domestically in China, in the internet, they're just, there's no information about them available online.
Yeah, I mean, again, we've already took that's how efficient it is. You know, the control of the internet there. I question. I think they released their statement on the 4th of June, or was it the 4th of June on I think they looked to do it on the Tiananmen Square anniversary, but obviously it didn't gain any traction because of other things going on in the West at the minute. So I think it's kind of backfired. It hasn't really left. It's been a bit under the radar, and I'm not too sure whether, again, maybe someone like Steve Bannon or the Epoch Times was maybe in conjunction with this.
There's some rumors of that coordination, and but it's just very surprising. And you're talking about tying in last week's about censorship, and this week about face, and how much authority and the immaculate perfection and of authority, and any criticism of that authority being shameful, even if it's rightful, even if it's somewhat ignorant, or it has malintent, even so to say. It's just unbearable and not tolerated whatsoever. That you could never do that. So you literally, Hao Haidong literally lost his face in one video in China. Yeah.
Well, you've got these two.
Literally, allegorically lost his face.
Yeah. Okay. The algorithms are turning, but these two massive polar opposites of East and West. Okay, and again, when we're saying East, particularly China, although a lot of it overspills into the other cultures there, whether it be Japan or Thailand, which are significant, is that in China and Japan, it's that this face cannot be challenged. Okay, it's stern. You will kowtow to the face. You will submit to that. The ideology is impervious. You cannot. Nothing else can seep in. And if you try to, you will disappear, and well, your face will disappear. Now, on the flip side, we've got the West, which is pretty much everyone is ideologically possessed at the minute. Everyone knows everything, and everything is challenged. All the authority is challenged, and the authority is flipping, and it's having to kowtow to the ideology. It's like the complete inversion of the face. For me, I'm just fascinated by seeing these two sides of the world just completely work in polar opposites. And you know, sometimes I think I'm losing my mind when I'm looking at. I can't really remedy the two together about how different it is. And I do think China understand it a lot more geopolitically than the West understand it, because China can play, it will certainly play into the game, because they do believe that it makes China stronger geopolitically on the international stage. It creates stability domestically in China, whereas you know, they can see this rapid changing, and how the face of the West is constantly changing and under threat. But in China, you have this stability, this strong arm of stability. You're much safer in the bosom of China. China will look after you. That's kind of how I'm reading it at the minute. Maybe I'm a bit too over analytical with it. Lewis, have you got anything else to add on this?
Yeah, so I was thinking about what you said, I think maybe last week or the week before, where you were saying that China can kind of use the sort of the difference between China and the West to their advantage in terms of censorship and propaganda. So basically they can get Chinese, you know, they can get what they want onto, you know, Western social media, YouTube and things, being critical of Western governments. But we, you know, Western countries couldn't do the same thing. We couldn't make a video criticizing China and then put it onto Chinese social media.
Yeah.
And in a way, like, you know, China can use it to their advantage, this difference between East and West. But I'm thinking with face, is it possible for a similar thing to happen? Is it possible for, you know, for Western countries to use this rigid concept of face to their advantage? For instance, they can get what they want by kind of like losing face, which the Chinese would see as a victory, but actually, you know, a Westerner wouldn't really care too much about. And then in some way kind of get what they want, but the Chinese are left feeling that they won because,
yeah,
you know, the Westerners lost face.
Well, that's how I think it's going to work, is that actually diplomatically, because I've been in plenty of these situations where like you're talking with these anecdotes where the Chinese people think that we're going to be embarrassed and shamed, and I'm like, well, I don't give a fuck. I really don't care. You know, I'm British. I'm full of remorse and self-depreciation and guilt, and you know, let's just get our heads down and just get on with it. And I think that, yeah, there might be some things diplomatically where we can maybe let China think or retain its own sense of self-importance and face, and we can kowtow to it and then just move on. But then I'm not sure how healthy that's going to be. Where do we draw the lines? You know, this is again one of the points made by one of the think tanks. It's where do you draw the line to kowtowing with anything? Do you get down on one knee? Do you get down on two knees, and then, or do you fully prostrate on the floor? You know, do you fully submit? And again, that's kind of what's happening in the West at the minute, anyway. So it's a difficult. I still think, like as I mentioned last week, about things like pushing against face Chinese traditional medicine, the idea of you know, softly questioning some things that are so rigid and saying.
Well, that's also in the news, isn't it? Recently about whether you can question traditional Chinese medicine now.
You can't. They've made it. They've made it so it's it's kind of an insult. They're kind of really closing the door on Chinese culture at the minute. They're creating this oneness. I mean, they're saying they've done it with saying you can't reproduce European buildings in China. As you know, a lot of China has these quite ugly. Some of them are okay, actually. Reproductions of famous European buildings like the Eiffel Tower in Hangzhou. Thames Town in Shanghai. They're all over China, and the official line is the CCP has said we don't want these being built anymore because they're low quality, they're a waste of money. But really, the idea behind it is that they don't want any cultural appropriation of the West. They don't want this idolizing of the West, people for it to be put on the pedestal. They're saying that we should double down on Chinese culture, be extra proud of it, pull up the drawbridge, and Jiao China. Trevor, I mean, that's what I think. Have you seen this, Trevor, on the news?
Yeah, we talked about this in previous episodes too. I mean, most of these places are a bit ridiculous because they're not all of them. A lot of them are failed real estate kind of projects. Certainly, the Paris and Hangzhou is. It's really Venice, Hangzhou. The recreation of a Venice-like city in Hangzhou without the most significant part of Venice being in water is somewhat more successful actually than the Paris one, in that it's got a better proximity to downtown Hangzhou and closer to the metro subway station. But I think it's more of an economic sense, and it's a bit ridiculous. It's like building all these ghost towns, and it's very easy to sell this concept of a very large real estate project if it's recreating a well-known high value real estate area somewhere in the West, whether that's Europe or the US or anywhere. But I guess the ideas that I wanted to touch on before we finish were, one, like, I think we're conflating two different concepts, and they do overlap a lot. One is this, I guess you would say, like this the role of authority, in China and in Eastern Asia particularly, and it's also in other countries obviously, where the power distance index, or the PDI, so it's referred to, is very real, and you can experience it throughout business and your personal and family life in China, especially if you're married into a Chinese family. And also face, which may actually not be unique to China. There may be issues where people avoid embarrassment in the US or in the UK or elsewhere, but not to the same extent, and it's not transferred. Like this idea of it's a physical, it's intangible, but it's almost possessive. Like face belongs to one person in the group more than anyone else in this hierarchy. So that you need to separate this idea of face and authority, this power distance index, when they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah. Okay.
You can gain face, like as a foreigner in China. Something that I could advise you is just speak positively of China in general.
Yeah.
Even if you're having a negative experience, or your job is not what you wanted or ideal, and you have real issues, and you're just BS it and say, I love China. I love, I don't know, something that you actually do enjoy, whether it's the food or how friendly people are. Maybe it's the lack of religious ideology, whatever it could be. There's a lot of things to like about China, and just say you love China.
It gets you a long way.
Yeah, it will help you so much.
Yeah, it really does. And you can be quite honest, even if you just focus on the things you like the food, the positive aspects, rather than just being negative. If you're constantly spouting negative things, it can really put up the backs of the, as it would in any country. You know, imagine someone just going over to America saying, "Oh, America's shit all the time."
Exactly. And people would just say, "Why are you here? Get out." And Chinese almost feel the same, but they won't directly say that to you because they won't want you to lose face.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it'd be like this hidden thing. So I think
just say things you like, and you're speaking to your colleagues, your familiars in China. Is be as positive, focus on the positive as much as possible. And if the negative is nothing you control, then don't talk about it. If the negative is something like your neighbors, I don't know, something you want them to change, then you could be a little bit, I don't know, somewhat discreet and subtle and make a suggestion, or your colleagues, and you're more likely to get it to change. And something I would say to you, John, I've been in that situation before when you were talking about the head of a high-ranking official being part of a business meeting, and then you being either too young or not being officially recognized as a expert and having the last word, or just simply being there's somewhat xenophobic tendencies, is that if you're subtle enough and you keep asking for stuff for the key decision maker, and who obviously wasn't this policeman, it was your business partner, or the person you're involved with. Ultimately, what happened in my situation, and how I got a working relationship with a chairman of a soccer club in China, is that ultimately, if I keep suggesting things and getting rejected, then one time, after a number of time, the chairman would basically, in another situation of which we're with a similar place with other officials and other people around, that he would suggest my idea, the same one he rejected many times.
Yeah, that's true. That's happened before.
And it would work. Like, things would happen. So, for example, we're starting up a grassroots movement and having volunteerism part of our project, and having a mentorship program where we take young adolescent soccer players, just like me. My first soccer coach was a high school player on my local team. And no coincidence, the first competitive high-level soccer games I saw were my high school, which in retrospect is not very hard, but I was 7 years old and grew up admiring these guys and learning how some simple skills from them from a young age, and trying to implement that in China. I got rejected at least 5 times for this idea, saying, no, adolescents, the high schoolers in China are too busy, blah, blah, blah. They don't have time. They're not good enough at soccer. They can't teach it. They don't have licenses, blah, blah, blah. After about 5 times, we got put into a big room, and it changed. We started this mentorship program, and guess what? It worked, and it lasted to this day, for over 10 years. And the kids were motivated to play. But it started with 5 no's, and it started not as my idea. It started as the chairman's idea.
Yeah, you've got to again, in China, you've got to let the right person take the right credit for it. You know,
right.
Maybe you're not the right person to get the credit for it. So yeah, it's all it's important to understand the nuances of it. Obviously, if someone's just coming into this to listen to this to try and understand what face is, I don't know if we've done a good job, because I think I still don't fully understand. I know when it's happening and I know when it's been infringed upon, but it's still very difficult to surmise it fully.
Have you heard the urban legend of this is an expat urban Chinese legend, where there's a group of businessmen in a meeting, and the highest ranking manager or whatever breaks wind and just lets one rip, obviously loud, and everyone can hear it. There's a moment of silence, and then one of the assistants or lower ranking officials goes, "Oh, excuse me," and everyone breaks out laughing, and the tension is relieved, and the problem is solved, and the face is saved. And the lower ranking official now is in higher esteem than he's ever been.
Yeah, that's actually a very good way of doing it. Someone jumping in to lose their face, to save their face, and then they increase their face. So they've increased their face by losing their face.
Exactly. I think And to say that you
If that doesn't clarify it, nothing else will.
If that doesn't clarify it, just forget about it, everyone. Tune out. So listen, guys, I think we're going to wrap this up because we don't want to try and go too much past an hour. We need to keep some kind of routine and format. So we just need to have a think about what we're going to do next week. We could move on to the economy. We could get deep into issues like Hong Kong. We could talk about WeChat and surveillance, or history. Look at Chinese history and link that back into the difference in perceptions, or maybe language. Look at some language breakdowns. Any ideas at the moment, or do you want to talk about this offline?
I'd love to hear Lewis and a little bit more about your blog and how that's going.
You mean you don't read it?
No, seriously, in terms of how, because you've been running it for a long time, I know, and I've seen some of it. It's quite
well. I mean, I think maybe
how has Mandarin learning changed in the last 10 years? I think it has.
Yeah, maybe we could talk about that, because I think the past a couple have been sort of like quite sort of heavier topics, at least like censorship and propaganda, and then talk about something that's a bit more kind of
accessible,
neutral, like no one's gonna it's not a controversial issue, is it, learning language, or is it? Can we make it controversial?
Yeah, I mean, look, we can look at language, because I think maybe we can do language with geography, tied in with some geography as well, making people understand, because we have so many regional dialects, and again, a lot of people don't really understand the differences there, and that would help people understand just how China is different. You can actually view China the same way you can view Europe, just as all these provinces can be kind of different countries. Maybe we could tie that in. Maybe something crazy will happen in the news in the next 7 days, and we might have to readjust if it's relevant.
Actually, what would be an interesting topic to talk about would be kind of like, because it could relate to language, is sort of the internal xenophobia in China towards migrant workers and people from other provinces, and particularly how that's often tied to if their Mandarin isn't good and they have a low opinion of people who are speaking a dialect. But obviously that's very different in Guangdong, where they're much more proud of Cantonese dialect, but that might be related to the status of Hong Kong. That gives space.
That would lead us on. That would lead us to Hong Kong. We could maybe have a chat about this offline in the week and see which way we're going to take. But hopefully we've given any listeners a bit more of an insight. We might try and tidy up the optics on the YouTube channel this week. But like I say, most of this is intended as a long form conversation, and it's archived at the minute. It's there for reference point further down the line.
Change the Joker.
The what? Sorry.
The Joker to the right. He's not a PNG with a cropped background.
The right, is he not? The Joker's on my right. Joker to the left of me. Clown to the left of me. Joker to the right. Huh?
No, in the previous videos, it was pixelated behind it though. It was not a PNG file.
What's happened there? I don't know. It's certainly not my whiz techniques on the internet, to be honest. So I might get a third party to look at this. Anyway, we're waffling. Boys, I'll catch you next week for another interesting topic in the middle. All right, see you guys.